Of Genesis chapter 2. This message that I'm bringing forward, originally I prepared back, I think it was in February, but what happened is we got snowed out and church was canceled that day. So now that Danny is gone, he asked me to speak today. And which seems to be my tradition. Every time I seem to step up here, I'm always prompted to cover a subject that I feel is vitally important, but for some reason just isn't being spoken about in the church. These things happen, and during the last period of the last few years, the history of the church has been is that there's a dwindling population of people who are attending church. This whole thing was exacerbated by COVID, when pastors decided, wrongly I would say, to shut down churches, all the churches throughout America, because the government said that it was going to be unsafe for them to operate, where other businesses operated completely with zero restrictions. Places like, Home Depot, Walmart, places like that. We basically, the message that was given to the American people through their pastors is that, you really can do church at home. You really can do church by yourself, and it's as valid as it is coming to church in person. And my message that I want to bring forth today is that's an absolute lie. It's something that's been sold to the church. And tragically, as you look at church attendance in America peaked around 1970. That's when we had our largest percentage of people who actually went to church on a regular basis. And then from that point in time, it started decreasing. It's interesting that I see a correlation with the moral degradation of the church and of the society at large started to happen after that point. I think it was around 1961 where Madalyn Murray O'Hair went against the Supreme Court and won to take prayer out of schools. As soon as we started doing that, it resulted in the demise of the nation. I'm not going to talk about that subject today, but the thing is that there's a different correlation between the moral stability, let me just use that word, of a nation and church attendance. So what I want to do is, from the very beginning, I want to talk about the Sabbath, when it was established, how it was established, and also the extreme importance of keeping the Sabbath still, even in this day. And we're going to see that Jesus absolutely was loyal to the Sabbath throughout his entire life. Always going into the synagogue, teaching in the synagogue. And as we'll see in Luke in just a little while, the book of Luke, we're going to see where that was Jesus' custom to actually go into the synagogue to worship or go into the temple to worship. Okay, so let's start out in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. And we're going to be staying in the beginning here, right in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible, so it'll be easy to go back and forth. And I just really want to urge you is use your phone or your Bible to look at these passages. For some reason today, I feel like it's so important to just look at these and not just hear them. I was woken up this morning at 3 o'clock, and the Lord was just really speaking to me about what you're about to talk about today is something that is important to me, and it's something that I want the body of Christ to hear. So I just want you to have a really keen hearing ear this morning. I really do. I think this is one of the most important things I've ever brought forth. And so let's go to Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 1. And it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. And here's the reason why. Because he rested from all his work of creating that he had done. So we can see the origins of the Sabbath day, the day of worship, was first established by God himself. And the interesting thing is when you look at all the 10 commandments, and this is something that's quite remarkable when you think of it, the fourth commandment to keep the Sabbath holy, it is the only commandment that God himself obeyed. Let that hit home. That's some pretty serious stuff when you really think about it. It's the only commandment that he obeys himself. He instituted it. He made the day holy. So in other words, what went on that actual day? Well, what God was doing, he was celebrating it. He was resting from and celebrating the great creation that he had just performed over the last several days. And the thing is that when we come together as a body, in a sense, we are celebrating our own birth because we're a creation of God that he rejoiced over. Even though he looked into the future that we were not yet created, it was something he was rejoicing over because God is a God of creation, continual creation. He's creating all the time. Here we just look outside for the first time driving into church today. We're starting to see those yellow flowers blooming. And I bet in the next week it's going to be glorious out here because of the wet weather. God is constantly creating. He's a God of creation. And when we come together, we remember that. We remember him. Okay, now the word in Hebrew for Sabbath actually comes from this Hebrew word Shabbat. And what that means, it means to desist, cease, or rest. In other words, it's a time to put everything aside, and it's time to just desist from everything you're doing, cease all your work, and basically concentrate on the things of God. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. I just want you to follow me as we go through this. Now, what I want you to do is go to the very next book of the Bible, Exodus 16. Now, as we go to this chapter here, Exodus 16, starting in verse 23, Exodus 16, 23, and I want you all to get there. I'm going to take my time between scriptures so you can actually see it with your own eyes. I just think it's so important. Starting in verse 23, 16:23, he says, he said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. This is Moses speaking. Tomorrow is going to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. Okay, and then later on, they say 6 days you are to gather, but on the seventh day of the Sabbath, and it's talking about the manna. See, what happened in those days at the time the Israelites were wandering through the desert, God would provide manna for them every single day, except the Sabbath. So what they would do on the day before the Sabbath, which would be Friday, what they would do is they'd gather up a double portion, and they would eat half of that on Friday, half of it on Saturday, and then on Sunday they go out and gather manna again. If they gathered manna, say too much manna on Wednesday, and took too much home, more than they were going to eat, and this happened to the Israelites, what would happen is it would be all contaminated with worms, as a testimony to their disobedience of not doing what was right. Now, I want to let's go just a couple. That was the first mention right there of the Sabbath, right there was Exodus chapter 16. Now let's just go a couple chapters down. Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 8. Now, if you'll notice when you go to the top of the chapter there, probably in all your Bibles at the top of chapter 20, what does it say? 10 Commandments. Okay, so what we're going to do, this is the very first listing of the 10 Commandments. Now, I just want you to kind of hold your Bible back from you a second and take a look at that. And as you look at that, you'll notice that the longest commandment is actually the fourth commandment. It has the most detail of any commandment in the 10 Commandments. Let's read it together. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And it's very explicit. We get instructions. It doesn't end there. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, now listen to this, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor even your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your town. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that are in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. Okay, that's so important. There's a lot of detail in that. Okay, now what I want to do also is look at this. Let's go to just a couple chapters down. Let's go to Exodus 31. Starting in verse 12. And this is when God is speaking to Moses regarding the Sabbath again. He's giving him some more details. Starting in verse 12. Exodus 31:12. And the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord your God who makes you holy. Observe my Sabbaths, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it will be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. This is the word of the Lord himself. Now, this might seem extreme, you know, what the Lord is saying. You know, if you violate the Sabbath, you'll be put to death. But the reason the Lord did this was just to show the incredible significance of this, the incredible importance of this. Now, we only see one example of a man who actually is going out and violates the Sabbath. And what happens is they actually bring him out to the edge of town. And what they do, at the edge where they were in the desert, and they actually stone this man. Now, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. So let's just go there. I just want to show you this briefly. Deuteronomy, it's the last book there of the Pentateuch there. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. Okay, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit here on that. I jumped ahead. Excuse me a second here. On Deuteronomy 5, verses 12, there's actually an additional thing that God wanted the Israelites to recognize on the Sabbath day. I got a little ahead of myself there. It says, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is starting in verse 12, 5:12. As the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son, daughter, and it goes on, your male or female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your animals, nor a foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male or female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So we can see, in addition to what we just talked about for the Israelite people themselves, the Sabbath was a time for them also to remember that one of the greatest events in their history was the deliverance of of the Israelites out of Egypt, which is mentioned, I believe, 138 times in the Bible. The whole concept of Israel being delivered from Egypt is one of the most central themes in the entire Bible. Now, I want to go back and let's go back to Exodus. So go back to the left there, and I want to look at a couple of these scriptures here, starting at Exodus 31. Exodus 31, starting in verse 12. Excuse me, these notes are kind of scratched here in a little bit unusual order here. Stand by a second, I just have to check one thing. Okay, excuse me for this. Let's go to Numbers chapter 15 is where I wanted to go. Numbers chapter 15. And I just wanted to show this example here. The Sabbath breaker is actually put to death. It says, while the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it was not clear what should be done to him. See, this is the first time they were dealing with this new law of the Sabbath, and they found somebody violating the Sabbath, and they weren't quite sure what to do, even though God originally gave them the command what to do with this. So they came before the Lord, and they asked the Lord, what should we do? So the Lord said to Moses, a man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as the Lord commanded Moses. Okay, now what I want to do is go back to the book of Exodus chapter 34. Because as we'll see, especially as we get into the New Testament, there are certain exceptions where a person can, in a sense, violate, and that's the actual proper word, can violate the Sabbath, but yet they're innocent. Jesus talks about a couple of these incidents, so we're going to be looking at these things. So we want to know what is acceptable behavior on the Sabbath and what isn't. Okay, but first what I want to do is look at this last scripture, Exodus 34:21. And on Exodus 34, verse 20, what says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing and harvest, you must rest. So you can see that was a big part of the Israelite community, obviously, is farming and gathering, especially during the time of harvest gathering. It was a very critical time. But God even said, even during this really critical time where, let's face it, sometimes the harvest was time sensitive. If you put it off or delayed it or did it at a slow pace, you were going to lose some of your crop. It was that simple. They didn't have the advanced farming techniques, obviously, they had today. But the Lord said, still, still, what I'm going to do is I want you to make sure, even during your harvest time still coming, I still want you to honor the Sabbath and rest. You know, it's kind of interesting. Part of this rest also is part of the way our human bodies are designed. By nature, we just need a time of rest, a time for our bodies to recuperate, our minds to rest. If we don't necessarily have jobs that are very physical, but sometimes they can be very mental, and they can be really challenging. I remember this one guy I ran into in the gym, and this is a good physical analogy of the need for a Sabbath rest. There's this young guy. I used to notice him in the gym. I only go 3 days a week. He was going every single day, and he was a young guy, about 19. And he came up to me one day and he says, "You know, I've been really working hard." Because we used to talk from time to time. I'm really working hard 7 days a week. I'm coming here in the gym, and I'm just making no gains. I'm just not getting any stronger. And I asked him, "Well, how many days a week you work?" He said, "Well, I come here every single day, And I said, your body needs rest. You're not giving it rest. That's one of the reasons you're not getting any gains, is because you're pushing yourself too hard and you're not giving your body any time whatsoever to recover." I said, "Take my advice, take a day off and see how things go." Well, I saw the guy about 3 weeks later, and he came back to me. He says, "You know what? You were right. I started working out less and taking a day off, giving my body rest, and I started seeing increases again for the first time." See, it's a natural thing that God has established in our body. We need rest. We physically have to have rest. It's really important. Unfortunately, many of our church are getting too much rest, okay? They're not observing the Sabbath. We're going to talk about that in just a little while, okay? Now, let's go to the book right now. What I want to do is let's go to the book of Isaiah. So you're going to go up quite a bit. Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58, starting in verse 13. Now, this is a promise that Isaiah gives us from the Lord about the blessings of keeping the keeping the Sabbath. Starting in verse 13, he says, "If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way, and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land." That's impressive. "And to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." It's interesting how he emphasizes that at the end of it. It isn't just his own opinion here. He says, this is the word of the Lord is spoken. So in other words, this is a prophecy that Isaiah speaks to us regarding the importance of keeping the Sabbath. Additionally, I'm just going to, you don't have to go there, but I'm going to say in Numbers chapter 28, verse 9 through 10, you see what happens because of the importance of the Sabbath. What happens is the priests perform double sacrifices on the Sabbath. They sacrificed twice as much on the Sabbath in order to show that it was a day of incredible significance. Okay? Now, and they did that. Now, of course, the priests were working on the Sabbath. There was a lot of work that went into skinning animals, preparing them, cleaning out the inner parts and whatnot. So the priests were actually working on the Sabbath, but they weren't violating the Sabbath. So we can see this is one of the first examples we'll see of things that were permitted on the Sabbath and that were working. And Jesus talks about this in a couple instances that we're going to look at in just a little while. Okay, Now, let's go to Leviticus, go back to the Old Testament again, Leviticus chapter 25. We want to look at a couple things here, and then we're going to be moving shortly after that into the New Testament. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. We're going to read 1 through 4, and then we're going to drop down a little further. Starting at verse 25. The Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest. A Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards." So we can see that even the land was given a rest, except in this case it was every 7 years. Okay? Now let's go down to verse 20, and we're just going to read a couple verses there. Because some people might think, wow, if we don't plant in the 7th year, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive? What are we going to eat? Well, the answer is in verse 20, right here. It says, "You may ask, what shall we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in." So you can see, because if the Israelites obeyed the word of the Lord in this case and gave the land a Sabbath rest, the Lord would magnify the crop and would completely take care of it if they were just obedient. Now we can also see in the scientific role in this whole thing is that obviously if many of you probably know about crop rotation. I mean, if you keep planting the same thing again and again and again, the land does not have an opportunity to recover. Now, this was a very simple way of replenishing the land so that it would continue to reproduce over the next series of 7 years. So it was something that the Lord obviously knew in his great wisdom, the way he designed creation, that this was something that the earth needed. It needed a rest as well. Before they started using, like today, they just farm the land. I used to fly for a farm, and it was interesting. Out the window of the office I was in when I was in flying, I could look out, and about every 63 days, I could see the guys planting, and the crop would come up, and they'd harvest the crop, and they'd just put another crop in, another crop, and all they just did, they kept this going just by using fertilizers. Okay, now, let's go to one thing I want to talk about is that a lot of people might think, this isn't really important. The land isn't given its Sabbath rest. But it's interesting. You'll see in this next chapter, in fact, starting in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 20 through 21, which just happens to be our biblical reading for today as we're going through the Bible. We're reading actually 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21. What happened was when Israel went off into, Judah to be correct, went off into captivity, what happens is they were punished with how many years were they going to be in Babylon? 70 years. Why? Where'd that number come from? Why was it 70 years? Why wasn't it something else? Well, let's take a look and see why this happened. Okay? Let's go to 2 Chronicles 36. 2 Chronicles 36. You can see how a Sabbath rest, even for the land, was an incredibly important thing for the Lord. He wanted to see the Israelites do this. As we go to 2 Chronicles 36, starting in verse 20, you will see And this is the record of the Lord. He says, he carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his intercessors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word spoken by Jeremiah. So what happens is you just take that mathematics there. Okay, every 7 years they didn't do the Sabbath rest, and they were put in captivity for 70 years. There was 490 years they disobeyed this rule. And God says, okay, you're going to do that. So what I'm going to do for every year that you didn't give the land a Sabbath rest, I'm going to give you a year of captivity. Sabbath was very, very important to the Lord, even for the land. Because when the people didn't give the land the Sabbath, what in effect were they really saying? They were saying, I'm planting my crops because I don't trust that promise you gave a couple scriptures back. You're not going to magnify the 6-year crop so that we're going to have 3 years of. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe the things of God. And God looked at this for 490 years and got sick of it. And they were punished because of that. Okay, now, when we're going to go to the book of Nehemiah, which is just a couple books up from there, just 2 books to the right. The book of Nehemiah, chapter 13. It's right at the end. Now, the book of Nehemiah, what the book of Nehemiah about is we just talked about that 70-year period of captivity. Well, the book of Nehemiah is the book which talks about Israel being reestablished in the land after their 70-year captivity. Under Nehemiah and Ezra, the Israelites came back into the area and possessed the land and started reestablishing the temple and reestablishing their religious practices. But again, what happened, and Nehemiah was quite outraged by this, the people went back to the same thing and started violating the Sabbath again. Okay? Now, let's look at Nehemiah 13, very last chapter of the book there. Starting in verse 15, Nehemiah 13:15. And this is Nehemiah saying, in those days I saw the people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who had lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing, so that God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. So what happened as we move along, a little further along in this story, finally what happened is the merchants he warned them, they still kept coming. He finally threatened them. He says, that we're going to have you arrested if you continue to do this. And then they stopped doing it. The merchants initially didn't even listen to him whatsoever. Now, what I want to do is let's jump. Now we're going to start looking at the New Testament scriptures regarding the Sabbath. Unfortunately, in the Christian church today, not only is there not any teaching on the Sabbath, but sometimes there's even teaching that is quite contrary to what the Word of God says. I was in a church near Dallas, Texas, when I was going through some training a few months back. I went to a church, and the preacher had a really sound message. He was talking on a very controversial subject that many pastors wouldn't even preach on. But unfortunately, in the middle of his message, he says, well, we are to obey all the commandments except the fourth commandment of the Sabbath. And I thought to myself, where is he getting that from? And I just want to be clear. I want to make this very clear, is there is absolutely in no way, shape, or form can you even imagine that there's anything in the Bible, anywhere in the New Testament, that says the Sabbath is null and void and we are not to observe it anymore. And you will see the history of it all throughout here, mentions the importance of the Sabbath and how even Jesus honored the Sabbath, as we're going to see in a little while. But first, let's go to the book of Hebrews, the 4th chapter of Hebrews. Fourth chapter of Hebrews, and I'll get you the verse as you get a little closer there. Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 9. Starting in verse 9, it says, "Where your ancestors tested and tried me, though for 40 years they saw what I did, that I was angry with this generation." Oh, excuse me, I'm reading in chapter 3 here. Excuse me. Okay, it says, starting in Hebrews 4:9, it says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his." Well, we see that this is being presented here in the book of Hebrews, which is probably at least 3 decades at a minimum after Jesus has departed and gone to heaven. So this lays down the importance of saying that it is important here, as we're instructed in Hebrews, to actually observe the Sabbath. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at Jesus' concern for the Sabbath. Let's go to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17. And Jesus is talking about the fulfillment of the law. And a lot of times this causes confusion. I'll address this in just a moment. Okay, and Jesus says here, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets." See, a lot of people today are trying to abolish the law. "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of the pen by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." So we can clearly see in this case that Jesus is saying that the law has not been done away with. Now, a lot of people will say, whoa, hold on a second. Now, there's 2 different areas of the law. There's the ceremonial law, which was done away with. But the moral law was not done away with and will never be done away with until the end. The moral law. Okay, so this is where a lot of people get confused. They say, the law is gone, and they don't realize it's clearly defined into 2 cases. Obviously, Jesus did away with the ceremonial law. He allowed the temple to be destroyed where the ceremony was being taken place. He allowed it to be destroyed twice. So we can see that especially in the second time when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, Jesus wept about it. He saw that it was coming forward. He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only they had recognized that the day of their visitation. I wanted to gather you together like a mother hen gathers chicks under your wing, but you were unwilling. Behold, your house is going to be left to you desolate." When Titus came in 70 AD and the Jews were slaughtered, the historian Josephus said as many as 1.1 million Jews were killed. It was unbelievable. It was an unbelievable slaughter that happened. And Jesus said that was largely due to their recognition. They didn't recognize the day of their visitation. And Jesus was crucified. Now let's go to just a couple chapters up, Matthew chapter 12. Now we're going to start seeing some limitations. There's some things that you could do on the Sabbath. It wasn't that you cease from every bit of work. And Jesus had a real controversy with the Pharisees in particular. So let's go to Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 9. It says, going from there to that place, he went into their synagogue. This is Jesus. And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and he was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Why did they want to kill Jesus? Because they said he was a Sabbath breaker. And the thing is Jesus obviously explains very clearly in showing them, how if you have an ox that falls or a sheep that, it falls into a well, aren't you going to rescue this thing? See, Jesus said that as you obey the Sabbath, there also has to be common sense. That's really what he's saying. It's important to also be able to do good on the Sabbath. Now let's look at a couple more scriptures. Let's just go to the next couple books up. Let's go to Luke 6. Luke chapter 6. Starting in verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them with their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now then Jesus used another example. He says, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? They entered the house of God, taking the consecrated bread. He ate what is not lawful, only for the priest to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So we can see in this case, this happened in the Old Testament. David and his companions were just extremely hungry, and they had no food, and they came to the priest and said, do you have any food? And the priest didn't have any food. He says, the only thing I have is this consecrated bread, which only the priest should eat. But Jesus emphasizes that David was correct to do this, even though he was breaking what would be considered the ceremonial law, because he needed to realize that these men needed to be energized and they needed to be revived after the great thing that just, I'm not going to talk about what had preceded that, but they had been in a great battle and they were famished, they were starving, they needed something to eat. And so you can see there are exceptions on the Sabbath. I want to look at one more thing. Let's just go up to Luke 13, just a couple chapters up here. Luke 13. Starting in verse 10. And we're going to read 10 through 16. It says, on the Sabbath, Jesus was teaching one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, woman, you are set free from your infirmity. Then he put his hand on her, and immediately she was straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days and not on the Sabbath. The Lord answered him, you hypocrites, don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out and give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has bound for 18 years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what had bound her? So you can see, obviously, the Pharisees were hypocrites. They realized that they were doing work, but yet they weren't calling themselves into account. But yet Jesus was doing an incredible work of this dear woman here who had been bound by a demonic spirit for 18 years. Jesus was bringing relief to that woman. What a beautiful thing, and they found fault in that. What a tragedy. It's unbelievable when we look at it. So we can see, let's go back to the very next book. Let's go back to the book of Mark. Mark chapter 2. And starting in verse 27. So in all these things we just covered, in that last verse there, 27 and 20, Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So we can see that the Sabbath was not made, in a sense, was not made for the Lord, even though we acknowledge him, but it was made for man. It was made for man to have a Sabbath rest. And we're going to talk about a little bit of how might a person go about doing a Sabbath rest, even aside from what we do just traditionally in church, what many of you are used to. And I'll explain a story about that in a little while. Now, one thing I want to look at is a lot of people don't understand is that Jesus was a faithful Sabbath worshiper. As we go to Luke, the next book over, let's go to Luke chapter 4. I just want to show this real brief, and we're gonna move on. Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 16. And this is talking about Jesus. He went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, which was his custom. See, Jesus had a custom that's what he would do. It was his hometown, Nazareth. He'd probably been going in there for years, and that was his custom, that he was a Sabbath observer. I just want to show that right there. Now let's just go up to Luke 23. The very end of the book of Luke. Luke 23, starting in verse 56. Now this is after Jesus had been buried. Jesus had been buried. They had just, anointed him, laid him in a tomb. And then at the end of chapter 23, verse 56, it says, then they went home and prepared spices and perfume, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So we can see we're firmly established in the New Testament. Jesus is in the grave, and the Jewish people are still, even though this is a time of extreme grief, but yet at the same time they saw the great importance of still observing the Sabbath in this very desperate hour for them. Now, after the resurrection, okay, let's see what happened after Jesus ascended into heaven. Now we're going to go into the book of Acts, and we're going to look at, well, what did they do in the book of Acts? Did they still continue to honor the Sabbath? Did they move it to another day? I mean, what happened here? Well, let's look at the facts here. I'm going to use the word here, because what I might talk about here in the next few moments here might be, perhaps you might consider somewhat controversial, but I'm going to say is let the Bible speak. Let it say what it says, and just read it for what it is. Okay, so let's go first to Acts chapter 15, and we're going to hit a couple verses very, very quickly here. Acts chapter 15, verse 19 through 20. Now, this is a very, very important chapter in the history of the church. This is part of what's called the Jerusalem Council. There were things that the leaders of the church were looking about is that, okay, now that we are entering into this new faith, let me just use that word. Okay, what do we still practice? What do we still not practice? Okay, so what it says right here, you can see starting in verse 19, it is my judgment. This is basically the decree that is made at the end. After they come together and they decide this is how we're going to proceed from this point. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles to turn into God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from foods polluted from idols, from sexual immorality, from meat of strangled animals and blood. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest time and is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So you can see at this particular point, they're still having Sabbath gatherings in the synagogues at this time. They're still meeting on Saturday. Okay, let's go to now. What we want to do now is let's go to Acts chapter. Let me stand by. I just want to look at one thing here. Okay, that's the very next. We're going to go to Acts chapter 13, verse 14. And as we can see, just this is where Paul's on his missionary journey. In Acts 13:14, we see on the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue. So you can see what was happening is Paul was still worshiping on the Sabbath day as far as Acts 13. Now let's go to Acts 17, a couple years later. We're going to go to Acts 17. In chapter 1. Verse 1, Acts 1, it says, when Paul and his companions had passed through these areas, they came to Thessalonica, where there were Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue. And there on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. So you can see at this particular point in time, the Apostle Paul and his followers were still Sabbath worshipers. Okay, you don't necessarily have to go to this one just for time-wise. As Paul is in Corinth, later the next chapter, it says, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. Okay, so we can see that clearly after Jesus is risen from the dead, and even a couple decades later, we can see that it seems like that by and large, the community of believers are still worshiping on Saturday. So the thing is that how did it get shifted to Sunday? How did this happen? This is Sunday. Here we are. We're sitting at. Why are we here? Why are we here Sunday? How did the Sabbath day, in a sense, get changed to Sunday? So we're going to look at that. And we're going to look at, now when you look at the mention this is just in the New Testament. If you look at the mention of the word Sabbath, okay, in the New Testament, the word Sabbath is mentioned 58 times. Now, the word Sunday is never used in the New Testament, but the way they referred to the day of Sunday was they called it the first day of the week. Now, there's 58 references to the Sabbath in the New Testament, but only 8 to the first day of the week. And 6 of those references are from the Gospels, where it just said on the first day of the week. For example, they went to the tomb and they saw Jesus had risen, and then in another gospel on the first day of the week, and the 6 references are only about that it involved Jesus and his resurrection on the first day of the week. There's only 2 references to the first day of the week, regarding any type of worship in the rest of the entire New Testament. So let's look at them, okay? Let's look at this. Now, we're just going to go a couple chapters down. Let's go to Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. So this is the very first reference that we see that there's worship on the first day of the week. It says chapter 20, verse 7, it says, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. So you can see that they were doing? They were sacrificing the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. We can see clearly that in this particular verse. Now, what I want you to do is, now the second one is this example here is 1 Corinthians 16. Let's go to the end of 1 Corinthians. Chapter 16, starting in verse 1. This is the other reference of the first day of the week, other than talking about the Lord's resurrection. 1 Corinthians 16, starting at verse 1, it says, now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian church to do. On the first day of the week, each one should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Now, when Paul's talking about this, it's not real clear the scenario, particularly what's going on. Was he saying on the first day of the week when we were gathered together to worship, or was he just saying this is something we want you to do regularly on the first day of the week? Scriptures aren't, if we're going to be biblically honest, it's not real clear. Many theologians think, well, yeah, it was, they had decided they were meeting on the first day of the week and they were worshiping together. But if we're going to be biblically honest, this on the second case, it's really, really not clear. Now, what I want to go to this next verse, let's go to the book of Romans. So this is the book, and this particular verse would be the verse that I would say that the church uses today to emphasize what I would use the word a flexible Sabbath. Now, I'm not saying that's the way I'm thinking. I'm just saying that's where the church at large is thinking. A lot of it comes just from this one verse here in Romans chapter 14, verse 5. Romans chapter 14, verse 5. It says, one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Now, there's also another scripture where I'm not going to get into, but it talks about not judging people in regard to Sabbath and new moons and things like that, all the traditional Jewish celebrations and whatnot. But this would be, I would say, the one scripture that indicates that, we may have flexibility regarding the day that we actually acknowledge as the Sabbath, but it is somewhat limited. So what I want to do now is I want to look at what really happened in history, because obviously as we get to the end of the New Testament, we're only about the area around 95 A.D. Well, what did the church leaders after that time, what did they actually do? Okay, there seems to be evidence that people still considered to worship on the Sabbath. There was kind of a mix, and then what happened is as we started coming into the year of the 300s, there were leaders of the time that tried to basically establish it. Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to change the day of Sabbath officially from Saturday to Sunday. Now, I have to be real honest with you, is that when you look at some of the historical things that have been written, some of the things that drove this idea to changing the Sabbath from a Saturday to Sunday were driven, to be honest with you, by anti-Semitism. We don't want to have anything to do with you Jews anymore, including your celebrations and even the day you celebrate on. Our Lord rose on Sunday. We're going to make that our day, so to speak. And there was a lot of thinking going. You can really do a lot of research on this. In fact, what I'm going to do is I really want to challenge you folks is to study your church history regarding this subject. It's something I believe that is is going to be coming up again and again. And what I'm going to say is that be like the Bereans in Acts 17. Go home and read the scriptures to see if these things are true. You know, I want you to decide for yourself, because a lot of people are deciding, you know, hey, aside from Sunday church, you know, hey, I'm going to have a Saturday Sabbath. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that I ran into several years ago, which was really eye-opening to me. So, getting back to history, there was a ruler of the Roman world at the time in 321 AD. Many of you might have heard this story. Constantine. Constantine was a ruler of the Roman world at that time. And Constantine, in a vision while he was going to battle, saw a vision of the cross, and he basically, his story was, when he saw this vision, it says, by this cross are you going to have victory over your enemies, so to speak. It's very roughly what was it. And it really emotionally affected Constantine. He converted to Christianity to whatever level. It's somewhat unclear if he was, you know, very much of a fervent follower of Christianity or just one that embraced it on a very low level. But what he did in AD 32, largely because of what happened to him, he established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire and established Sunday as the actual day of worship. Okay? Now, during this whole period we're talking about, there was a real emphasis to change the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday for two main reasons. Number one is that the resurrection happened on a Sunday, the first day of the week. And number two, that Pentecost happened 50 days after the Sabbath, before Jesus died. Okay, so 50 days it fell on another Sunday, another extremely important day in the history of the church. Okay, so because of these two factors, there were many of the church fathers were trying to move the day of worship to Sunday. So the next instance of this is we have in AD 325, 4 years later, there was a bishop of Rome. His name was Sylvester. The Catholic Church looks at this man as being a pope, but to be perfectly honest, the papacy really didn't come into its modern day form until about the year about 500 AD. I won't get into that too much, but he would be considered by the Catholics as a pope. And in 325, he established that the day of worship was supposed to be Sunday. Now we go just about a decade later. There's a very famous church father. Many maybe have heard of him. His name is Eusebius. And Eusebius said that in AD 38, he said, Sabbath has been transferred to Sunday. That was his proclamation. Okay, and then there's a gathering called the Council of Laodicea in AD 36. And what they came out of their great meeting was a meeting of many church leaders, is they established again in AD 36 that they reestablished and affirmed the idea that the day of worship is going to be on Sunday. So that's the historical progression of what actually happened. These are the facts surrounding this particular thing. So a lot of people are looking at this and re-examining this. Now, I want to be real clear about something, and I want you to really listen to me closely on this. The main emphasis of what I'm trying to bring forward today is number one, and number two comes way beyond it as far as day of worship, is that we need to be into the house of God, period. That's what I'm trying to emphasize, okay? And you might say, well, why do I need to hear this? I'm in the house of God right at this very moment. This is a key teaching that we need to bring out to our, what I would call our marginal brothers and sisters who are, kind of come to church when they feel like it, when it's convenient. As long as there's not football on, a basketball championship, my kids aren't playing soccer, baseball, or whatever it has. And I remember when I used to live in Santa Maria, I used to go to church every Sunday, and every Sunday when I used to go by, they used to have hundreds of kids on the soccer field. And it used to grieve me just going by of just seeing how the parents were showing that their kids that this is what's important on a Sunday is these sports events rather than, and it would be such a great lesson that they could teach their kids. So on this day, I'm sorry, you're sitting out. You're not going to baseball, football, flag football, whatever it happens to be, whatever event, because this is a holy day to the Lord. It's only one day a week. And the thing is that I remember many of you, I can look at some of you, maybe some of you who are younger don't remember this, but I can remember when I was a young boy where everything was closed. Everything was closed. The pharmacies weren't even open. Gas stations closed. Food stores closed. Everything was closed. And what's very interesting is right around the time when prayer was taken out of the schools, I think that's a pivotal point in our entire history of this nation, is that suddenly, I shouldn't say suddenly, but gradually certain things would be open. Oh, the pharmacy down the street's open because we got to have the pharmacy. And the food store's open because, gosh, we have to have this. You want to have a shock of your life. Go to Israel. Go to Israel and see what happens on sunset in downtown Jerusalem. It looks like the city has been evacuated. I remember when I went there in 2013. They are very, very, even people who are literally atheists observe the Sabbath there. Everything is shut down. They prepare their meals the day before, and then a lot of times they'll have what will be called a Shabbat dinner, which is just a Hebrew word for Sabbath dinner. But everything is prepared the day before. Unfortunately, in America, Sunday means nothing to most people. And I just want to encourage you to encourage others. This is the main thing I really want to bring forth with this message, is I want you to encourage others to get back to the house of God. And 2, do not accept their excuses. A lot of people say, well, I've been injured in the church, and hey, I can go out to the mountains and I can, worship God, and I can do my thing and whatnot. And it's like, no, that's not what Jesus did. It was in Luke 4:16. What did it say? It was his tradition. He did it every time. And my whole thing in a town of Reno, whoever hears this message in the future, if you live in a large town and a town as Reno probably has at least 100 churches, at least. If you can't find a church that you're going to be happy with out of 100 churches, the problem's not with the church. You're the problem. You're never going to find a church that's perfect unless you start it yourself. And that's what a lot of people are doing. It's the church of self. And even some Christian people are doing this. Oh, well, I have a friend of mine right now, since I just don't like the local churches. I just stay home and I listen to a pastor online and whatnot. It's not biblical. It's not healthy. It's destructive, and it sets a bad example. We need to, whenever possible, be in the house of God. There's going to be times when we go on vacation. There are going to be times just like in the Bible, where you have to take care of things. They had to take their ox to be watered. They had to do certain things, or they would violate the Sabbath, or maybe wouldn't participate in the Sabbath. There are exceptions to the rule. The Lord knows that. But by and large, that needs to be the top of our list of what we need to be doing week by week by week. It's so important. I'm coming into a time right now where I'm going to be working some really hard shifts. I mean, I'm going to be going to work occasionally at 8 and getting off at 8, and sometimes even later than that. And I'm making the determination, I don't care if I've been up all night, I'm going to be here. And I have a good excuse not to. I'll be dead tired. I'll be flying all night and I'll get home. But I'm going to honor the Sabbath. I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be here as an example to all those around me that, I'm not going to make a lame excuse, and not that would be a lame excuse. I mean, after being up all night, but I'm going to be here because it's critically important. Now, I want to close with just one more thing. I want to tell you a story. Back in 2013, 2014, after I finished my degree in biblical studies, I was fascinated by church history, and I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be really interesting to go around to every single church in my town in Santa Maria, California, which is south of San Luis Obispo, and visit these towns just as an almost like a spiritually educational thing to see what. I've never been in a Lutheran church, never been in an Episcopal church, never been in a Methodist church. I want to see what they did. Okay, so over a period of a year and a half, I went to every single church in the town. It was 76 of them. And I went there, and one church I'd never went to was a Seventh-day Adventist church. I never went to. Of course, I had to go there on a Saturday. They believe very heavily in Saturday worship. So I went there and I met with the pastor, and he sat down. I asked him, "Hey, can I meet with you in your office? Another day of the week?" And I thought, I'm going to meet with this guy. I figured, probably be 15, 20 minutes. I'll be out. I ask him a few questions. I'll be on my way. Well, the interesting thing was 3 hours later, we parted ways. We had an incredible conversation. He talked to me a lot about the Sabbath and whatnot, why they honor it, what they do and whatnot. And then I asked him, and this is the point I really want to get to, is that, what do you do on the Sabbath? Your Sabbath is, obviously you're Seventh Day Adventist. And obviously the two things that they emphasize is the seventh day of worship, and Adventist means obviously the second coming of Jesus. So the two things, just like why do they call people Baptists? Well, they really stress being saved and what? Baptized, okay? That's why a lot of these people have these particular names, okay? Methodists were largely they were a holiness group. Now they've gone into insanity. But by and large, they were a church of holiness. I'm getting off the track. But on the seventh day, I asked him, give me an example. What do you do? What do you do on your Sabbath day? He says, we get together. It's sunset when the Sabbath starts, and we have a prayer together. We have a really nice meal. And our family just sits around and we talk about our week, and we talk about issues, our family issues, and share with each other, various different things, just encouraging each other. And, we get up the next morning. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll go drive somewhere, maybe go on a nice hike and have a nice event where all of us can be together that day, Saturday, and just have a good time and then we'll close it out by having a time of Bible reading as the sun is setting on Saturday night. Now, I'm doing a poor job of describing what he told me, but when he told me this, I was overwhelmed by the beauty of what he was doing. It just was unbelievable. And I thought to myself, this is something that I really need to concentrate more on myself. This man knows something that I don't. And I think as we move forward, we got to keep our eyes open. I believe God is going to be revealing to us truths that we somehow didn't see or we overlooked through a course of time. I know my friend Clint here has informed me about some things that I've never considered regarding God the Father. That's something that has been revealed to him, and the importance of understanding that. And I know that this is going to be happening in the days ahead. So I saw this thing that I read somewhere where it talked about, how might a person celebrate a Sabbath? It was like a guide. How do you? And it basically says just pick a day and a time. Prepare before time to clear out that day's schedule so you can have the freedom to have a Sabbath worship. It says compile a not to do list. You know, hey, if you have things to do, laundry to do, do it at another time. House cleaning, do it before or after. And it says engage in spiritual practices that help you draw closer to God, like being with your loved ones, meditating upon what God has done, even in this last week, the great blessings. I mean, just think of this week. Here's a nation in virtually to a person almost in total rebellion against God, but yet look, he's given us another week of peace. We don't deserve it, but he gave it to us, and that's something to glory in, that we are not at war like Ukraine and Russia and many other nations, And it says plan soul restorative activities that help you rest and delight in God, and that can be something just as simple as reading the scriptures. But I just want you to read about that and just really encourage you is to study this subject and really consider it. I really believe it is something that the church is missing. In all my years, I've never heard once anybody ever preach on it. But yet, as you can see I went through the whole history of the Sabbath from the Genesis 2 into the New Testament. It is something that is incredibly important to God. There's been, in our church, to be honest with you, we've had some numbers drop off lately, and I'm just being honest. And what I would say is just gently, and I really emphasize that word gently call somebody on the phone. Hey, I haven't seen you in church in a while. Hey, come on back. We miss you. And we do, and just be real loving to the people and just let God's house be full. It's one of my favorite scriptures in the entire Bible. David said, I was glad when they said, let us go up to the house of the Lord. And I want to end on that. I didn't even plan on saying that, but I think that's a perfect scripture. Let us, if we're not there, come back to that point again. Is when Sunday comes, for us, when the Sabbath day comes, that we're excited because we're going up to the house of God. And we're going to be filled with something new. And it's going to give us an opportunity to love our brothers and sisters and minister to our brothers and sisters and form relationships and acknowledge the great things that God is doing, not just among ourselves, but our families. And the mercy that God is showing upon this nation is just, to me, is unfathomable. We don't deserve it, but yet he continues to give us. Look what he did in these last 2 water seasons. Our reservoirs are full. The flowers are blooming. I mean, we are such a blessed nation. I just can't comprehend it. So with that, be blessed today, everyone. Please take this message seriously and think about how you might encourage yourself in this. And this also applies to, I know Gio, my friend Gio, who read the scripture today, he has a home fellowship. That's a valid situation. You don't necessarily have to be in an established building with a sign on it. Obviously, as we see in the past, the apostles and the Christians, they went from home to home. That's valid. So I wanted to be clear on that as well. So anyhow, be blessed, everyone, and thank you for your attention during this message. You're welcome.